The 12 pairs of cranial nerves emerge directly from the brain, and the 31 or 32 pairs of spinal nerves attach directly to the spinal cord. From where, then, do the named nerves arise that supply each superior limb and each inferior limb? The anterior branches of the last 4 cervical spinal nerves and of the first thoracic spinal nerve on each side form the left and right brachial plexus. Each plexus is a network of nerve fibers, and from it the named nerves that supply the superior limb on that side of the body are derived. These include muscular cutaneous nerve, the median nerve, ulnar nerve, radial nerve, and 11 others. The ulnar nerve, incidentally, is sometimes traumatically impacted, and the resulting unpleasant tingling sensation are ascribed to the funny or crazy bone. A similar network of nerve fibers from the anterior branches of the lumbar and sacral spinal nerves forms the left and right lumbosacral plexus. Each one supplies 17 nerves to the inferior limb on that side, including the femoral nerve, obturator nerve, and the largest nerve in the body, the sciatic nerve. This nerve courses down the posterior side of the thigh and divides to form the tibial and common fibular nerves, which are distributed to the lower parts of the limb.
I'm Mike Shively, and this is Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. Today we want to talk about the peripheral nervous system. Now in a previous session we talked about the central nervous system, including brain and spinal cord. Today we want to talk about the peripheral nervous system, but do you have any questions about anything that we've talked about before we begin today's session?
I had a question about the threshold, how the threshold works.
Threshold. Let's put that word back up because we went over it kind of quickly the other day. Go with the overhead camera. The threshold voltage, or what physiologists talk of as threshold, Susan, is the voltage at which a neuron suddenly will depolarize and repolarize spontaneously on its own. In other words, it's the voltage required to start an impulse. Now, to put this in perspective, remember we said that resting neurons were sitting there with a resting cytoplasmic voltage of somewhere in the vicinity of minus 70 millivolts. That's the resting voltage. If we raise that neuron up to minus 60 or minus 50, probably nothing happens. If it has a threshold voltage of minus 40, though, if that happens to be the threshold voltage for that particular neuron, if we get the voltage raised all the way up from minus 70 up to minus 40 and reach threshold, then an impulse will occur in that neuron. Now, in sensory receptors, sometimes the thing that raises the voltage in a sensory receptor is not necessarily, it's not going to be a voltage of another neuron coming in, but it's going to be some kind of a physical stimulus. Perhaps for a rod or cone cell, for example, if you shine a light on a rod or cone cell, the light causes that cytoplasmic voltage to raise up to threshold, and then the rod or cone generates an impulse. Or for a heat receptor in the tip of your finger, for example, if you warm it up, by warming it up, you raise the voltage in it somehow, and there's different mechanisms where these work in different receptors, but you raise the voltage up to threshold, and then an impulse is generated. Now, sensory receptors themselves, of course, do not transmit impulses, they simply generate impulses, but once they've generated the impulse, then they synaptically transfer the impulse to a sensory neuron, again with a neurotransmitter that does what? Raises the voltage in that sensory neuron up to threshold, and then the sensory neuron has the impulse and carries it on into the brain or spinal cord.
Okay.
Good question. Anybody else have any questions? Starley?
You were talking about the meninges yesterday, and you said they were made up of the dura mater and the arachnoid mater.
Actually, let's go to the overhead camera again. The meninges are actually 3 different layers. You mentioned 2 of them. Remember, the singular of this word is meninx, M-E-N-I-N-X. It's kind of one of those funny words, has a little different form in the singular and plural form. The outermost one was dura mater, and that's connective tissue proper, and it's pretty heavy and strong, dura mater. And then deep to it is arachnoid mater. And then there's a little bit of a gap between the arachnoid mater and the deepest one, which is pia mater. Now I want to show you something with a little drawing here that may help put what I was trying to say in perspective. If we have transverse section of the spinal cord here, here's some gray matter, for example. Here's some white matter. The pia mater is right on the very surface, and it's a very thin layer, right on the very surface of the brain or spinal cord. The arachnoid mater is actually separated from the pia with a little bit of a space. So there's a little bit of a gap there. It's a very small gap. And there are little filamentous strands of arachnoid mater that go down to the pia. Now this space is one of the places where we find cerebrospinal fluid, and as you'll recall, we mentioned it's called the subarachnoid space. The reason this middle meninx, if you will, was called arachnoid mater was because when anatomists were first looking through a microscope at this, they thought these little strands that went down, these little filamentous strands, looked like spider web. And so, you know, arachno is a word that refers back to spider. And then outside this yet is the dura mater. So it's a thick, heavy layer on the outside. When we take the meninges off of a brain in the gross lab, what actually happens, the pia mater stays attached to the brain or spinal cord, and these little filamentous strands break right in here. So that when we pull one of those off, like the one I showed you yesterday, I'll pull it back up here and put it on the overhead. So this is dried out meninges. It's mostly dura and arachnoid, because when this was removed from the brain, these little filamentous strands broke and the pia mater stayed adherent to the surface of the brain. Does that make sense when you look at it? Okay? Good. PNS, peripheral nervous system. Let's remind ourselves what the components are, and we'll do that by looking at our first graphic here. The components of the peripheral nervous system are cranial nerves and spinal nerves, or we could just say nerves, ganglia, and there are two different kinds of ganglia, what we call sensory ganglia and what we call motor ganglia, also known as autonomic ganglia. And the third component of the peripheral nervous system is sensory receptors. We'll try to get at least two of these things talked about today, and we may talk about sensory receptors in a future session. So we'll begin our discussion with nerve, and we probably ought to define a nerve. Go to the overhead camera for just a second, put the word up. A nerve is a bundle of axons or dendrites. Let's just say a bundle of nerve fibers, axons or dendrites, in the peripheral nervous system. A bundle of nerve fibers in the peripheral nervous system. These could be axons or they can be dendrites, but we're out in the peripheral nervous system. Now, when bundles of axons or dendrites get into the central nervous system, we call that bundle a fiber tract. So a nerve in the peripheral nervous system, conceptually, is the same as a fiber tract within the central nervous system. Back to the overhead camera for just a second. Let's pretend like we've got a bundle of those, and the connective tissue that surrounds the whole bundle all the way around is given a name. It's CT proper, connective tissue proper, but it's given a name, epineurium. That's simply the connective tissue proper ensheathment around a whole bundle of nerve fibers. And then individually, within that bundle, there are groups of fibers that are surrounded by connective tissue ensheathments. So we've got a big bundle of smaller bundles here. And each one of these smaller bundles of nerve fibers is surrounded by connective tissue proper that's called perineurium. So it's P-E-R-I, neurium. So that's the CT proper that would be like right there, right over here, and so forth, just around each individual bundle. Finally, the delicate CT proper encasement that would be around each individual nerve fiber. And I can't draw them small enough, but we'll pretend like these little black dots represent individual axons or dendrites. If we actually had the connective tissue encasement around an individual one of those, then that is called endoneurium. Do these three words, epineurium, perineurium, and endoneurium, remind you of anything that we might have talked about one other time, Eva?
The epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium and muscle.
Exactly.
Cells.
The connective tissue ensheathments that we talk about here it's the same concept around of the connective tissue encasements around a bundle of muscle fibers. Around the whole muscle, that connective tissue encasement's called epimysium. Around individual bundles of fibers within the big belly, it's perimysium, and then endomysium around an individual muscle fiber itself. So that's a basic concept of the anatomy of a nerve per se, of an individual nerve. What we want to do is spend a bit of time talking about cranial nerves, and then a bit of time talking about spinal nerves. Now, the cranial nerves are called cranial nerves because they originate directly from the brain. They physically attach to the brain. And there are 12 pairs of those cranial nerves, left and right versions of each. I'm going to bring this brain model up here. We'll look at the overhead camera, look at it through the overhead camera for just a second. And we're looking at the bottom of the brain. This little red thing right here is actually the pituitary gland, the cerebellum. These are the temporal lobes and the frontal lobes that we talked about in a previous session of the cerebral hemispheres. On this plastic model, the actual stubs of the cranial nerves, right where they're emerging, are shown as these little white structures right in here. And these are the olfactory bulbs. The olfactory nerves come off the end of those. There's the optic nerves, but all these little white things. So the cranial nerves all originate here directly from the brain. Almost all of them, in fact 11 pairs of them, come off the underneath side of the brain or brain stem. There is one pair that actually comes off the top side, the fourth cranial nerve. I don't know if I can show it to you very easily or not, if the camera can pick this up, but you can see this little fella coming out right here. That's the fourth cranial nerve, the trochlear nerve, that's actually emerging from the top side of the brainstem and then coming around to the bottom. Now, once these nerves come off the brain, once these 12 pairs come off the brain, what they do next is they pass through various foramina in the skull and go out to various structures, primarily in the head and neck region. There are a couple of those cranial nerve pairs that get beyond the head and neck, but most of them are distributed to structures that are right there in the head area. And what I want to do is I want to go through the 12 pairs one at a time, and I want us to learn the names of the 12 pairs, and probably from those names we can figure out what the general function, or at least one of the general functions, might be. So I'm going to write a name up here, the first pair of cranial nerves. I'll put number 1. There's a left and right olfactory nerve. I bet you can look at the name and figure out what it does. Who wants to venture a guess here? Bryce?
Is it smell?
Sense of smell. The only thing that the olfactory nerve does is carry sensory fibers that are carrying impulses that are going to be related to sense of smell. They're going to be interpreted by the brain as sense of smell. Has no motor functions whatsoever. So that's cranial nerve number 1. Real easy to remember once you see its name, I think. Let's take a look at the name of the second one here. The left and right optic nerves, second pair of cranial nerves. I'll bet you can figure that out. Starley, what do you think that one does?
For sight.
The only thing the optic nerve does is carry sensory neurons that are related to vision. Their impulses are going to be interpreted when they get to the occipital lobes of the cerebral hemispheres. They're They're going to be interpreted as vision. So these first two are pretty easy to remember because the name gives away what it does, I think. The next one's a little more cryptic, but you can probably guess. Oculomotor. Left and right oculomotor nerves come off the bottom of the brain. Can you look at that name? What's this oculo probably have something to do with?
The eye.
Eye. And you see this word motor? I'm going to bet that this cranial nerve carries impulses out to muscles that are associated with the eye. Don't you suspect? And that's the primary function. Supplies some of the muscles that move the eyeball around, and it also supplies some of the smooth muscle structures inside the eyeball that have to do with the iris in particular. So those are the first three pairs: olfactory nerves, optic nerves, oculomotor nerves. Notice they all start with O. I think that's just a coincidence. We go to the fourth one. Fourth cranial nerve is the trochlear nerve. Left and right trochlear nerves. Fourth pair. The trochlear nerve supplies one of the, matter of fact, the smallest of the extrinsic eye muscles. It's a little skeletal muscle that is involved in eye movements. And the name is derived from the fact that that particular muscle, the superior oblique muscle of the eye, actually passes through a little cartilaginous ring-like structure called a trochlea. So that's where the name is derived. So this one just carries some motor fibers out to one of the muscles that move the eyeball around. Then we get to number 5. The fifth pair of cranial nerves are the trigeminal nerves. Now, look at this name for a second. Trigeminal. How many parts is it going to have?
3.
Going to have 3. And let's go ahead and list its 3 main components. One of its branches is called the ophthalmic nerve, O-P-H-T-H-A-L-M-I-C. One of its branches is called the maxillary nerve, and one of its branches is called the mandibular nerve. Those are the 3 main branches, and it's the reason it's called trigeminal. Now, the ophthalmic nerve carries sensory fibers of a general nature, hot, cold, pressure, pain, touch, from the eye and the upper eyelid, forehead, kind of the top half of the head really on the front side, but it only goes down to kind of the upper eyelid and the eyeball. When you get a grain of sand in your eye and it hurts, it's the ophthalmic nerve that are carrying those impulses. The optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2 up here, all it does is the vision thing. So it carries sensory impulses related to vision. This one carries impulses related to hot, cold, pressure, pain, touch, general kinds of sensation from the eye area and forehead and so forth. The maxillary nerve carries sensory impulses of a general nature from the lower eyelid, face, upper lip, upper teeth. It's kind of starts at the lower eyelid and kind of goes down and gets the upper teeth and the palate, roof of your mouth kind of thing. General sensory impulses. So when you eat that piece of pizza, it's too hot, you know how you can't wait, and you get it in there and the cheese kind of fries the incisive papilla there on the roof of your mouth. You know, it's the maxillary nerve. It's telling you that you did that. The mandibular nerve carries general sensory impulses from lower teeth, tongue, floor of the oral cavity, and that sort of thing. Now, how many of you have ever had drilling and filling done on lower teeth? Just about all of us, I guess. All right. Have you noticed that when the dentist injects the local anesthetic, and they're real good about sneaking that needle around till you never really see it, you know. But when they inject that, they make a single injection. If they're going to work on lower teeth, make a single injection way back here in the back, and what they're doing is injecting that local anesthetic right on top or real close to the mandibular nerve here, just before it goes into the mandible. And of course that will, when we put the local anesthetic on there, it'll interfere with nervous impulse transmission, so all the sensory impulses that would be coming up from the teeth and lower lip and everything on that side are deadened, and you don't have those impulses anymore. And have you ever noticed that you feel, you have to reach up here and make sure you still got a lower lip? Is it still there? Yeah, Adam?
Does it actually block the impulse transmission or generation? I mean, are those pain receptors still down there just going crazy? It's just not making it to your brain?
It blocks impulse transmission. The sensory receptors still do their thing. They pass the impulse over to the initial parts of those sensory neurons, but it gets up to where the local anesthetic has been deposited, and the impulse doesn't go any further than that. The maxillary nerve, of course, does innervate the superior teeth, but there's not a convenient place for a dentist to really make a single injection. So those of you who have had drilling and filling done on upper teeth may recall that they'll make a series of small injections right around the tooth that they're working on, rather than trying to make a single injection. See, if they're going to work on a lower teeth, it doesn't make any difference which tooth it is. If it's on the left or right side, they'll be on the opposite sides. But they'll make a single injection way back here, and it'll deaden everything around to the midline. All right, number 6 in the cranial nerve lineup today is the abducens nerve. Left and right abducens. I think I kind of misspelled that, didn't I? Let's try that again. I'll put another letter in there. Let's try that. The left and right abducens nerves supply one particular muscle of the eye. And so if we take a look at this list, we mentioned this one, and we mentioned this one, and we mentioned this one. Cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6 all supply skeletal muscles associated with the eye and are involved in eye movements. And the oculomotor nerve also supplies some smooth muscle structures within the eyeball. So we got 3 different cranial nerves here that are involved in motor impulses for eye movements, and we've got a couple of them that are a couple branches of the trigeminal that are carrying sensory fibers related to sensations from the eyeball, general sensations. So that's the first 6 pairs of cranial nerves: olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, and abducens. Any questions on those? Yes, darling?
Which eye muscle does the abducens go to?
The abducens goes to the lateral rectus muscle. Now, we haven't talked about the eye yet, but when we get to the eye, we'll actually look on some models at the various eye muscles and talk about, well, when this muscle contracts, the eyeball rotates this direction. And so it's the lateral rectus muscle. Thanks. Sometimes anatomy students, let's go to the overhead for just a second. I want to show you something. Sometimes the anatomy students will use this little memory aid, LR6, SO4, and the rest with a sub 3. And what they mean by this particular memory aid is the LR here stands for lateral rectus muscle, and it's innervated by the 6th cranial nerve. The superior oblique muscle of the eye, you don't even know the names of the muscles of the eye yet, but that's innervated by the 4th cranial nerve, and all of the rest of the eye muscles are innervated by the 3rd cranial nerve. LR6, SO4, and the rest 3. That's what that little memory aid's all about. All right. Moving on now. We've talked about the first 6 pairs of cranial nerves. Let's go to cranial nerve number 7. Go to the overhead. Cranial nerve number 7 is the facial nerve. It actually has several different functions. It supplies the muscles of the face, and that's probably where it derived its name. Several small skeletal muscles that actually are involved in the motions that we call facial expressions, okay? When you frown or smile or purse your lips, and it's various facial muscles that are doing that, and the facial nerve supplies those. In addition, the facial nerve supplies some motor fibers to a couple of glandular structures. It supplies the lacrimal gland up in the eye, and it also supplies the salivary gland. And finally, the facial nerve carries sensory fibers from taste buds on the anterior aspect of the tongue. So when you taste something on the front of your tongue, those impulses are being carried into the brain by the facial nerve. Amber?
You're saying it like does facial expression when you like wrinkle your eyebrows, or I mean your eyebrows, sorry, your forehead. Is that the facial nerve doing that, or I thought you said maybe the ophthalmic did your forehead?
No, the ophthalmic, I may have said it wrong a while ago, but the ophthalmic is carrying sensory impulses, so general sensations from like hot, cold, pressure, pain, touch from up here, that's ophthalmic nerve. But the facial nerve is the one that carries the motor fibers out to any muscles that would wrinkle your brow.
Okay.
Sure. All right, cranial nerve number 8, vestibulocochlear nerve. Kind of have to dial in the accent before you get there. Vestibulocochlear. Now, once we learn more about the ear, this name will actually make more sense, but the nerve is distributed entirely to the internal ear. And the internal ear is located within the temporal bone. As a consequence, this nerve, once it leaves the brain, it goes into a foramen to leave the cranial cavity, but it never makes an appearance outside the skull because the only place it's headed for is internal ear structures, which are buried within the structure of the temporal bone. So the vestibulocochlear nerve is kind of distinctive when you're playing cranial nerve, Trivial Pursuit. Remember this one. It's kind of distinctive, and it's the only cranial nerve, of course there's left and right versions, but that's the only cranial nerve pair that does not emerge outside of the skull. Never passes all the way through the skull, if that makes sense. Cranial nerve number 9 is glossopharyngeal. Glossopharyngeal nerve. Can you see tongue in this? Glosso, can you see pharynx in the name? This one actually carries sensory fibers related to taste from the back part of the tongue, so that's where the glosso comes from. It supplies some of the skeletal muscles in the pharyngeal region. That's where the pharyngeal part of the name comes from. It also supplies some motor fibers to some salivary glandular tissue. So those are some of the kinds of things that this one does. 9th pair of cranial nerves, glossopharyngeal nerves. Number 10 is vagus. Notice it's spelled different than the town. Vagus nerve is one of those nerves that gets well beyond the head. It's the, quote, longest cranial nerve. Matter of fact, it streams all the way down through the thoracic cavity, supplies fibers to the heart, to some lung tissue, goes all the way down into the abdominal cavity, and it's the main cranial nerve that is motor to glandular structures and to smooth muscle structures within the digestive and respiratory systems. It supplies some skeletal muscles in the larynx. It does a lot of different kinds of things. Number 11 is the accessory nerve. Left and right accessory nerves supply certain skeletal muscles in the neck and shoulder region. And let's just go ahead and get number 12 up here. Hypoglossal nerves. The left and right hypoglossal, can you see under and tongue here in the word? These actually come up on the underneath side of the tongue and enter the tongue to supply the skeletal muscles that move the tongue around. There's actually several individual bundles of fibers involved in tongue movements. There's some intrinsic muscles of the tongue and there's some extrinsic muscles of the tongue, and most of those are supplied by the hypoglossal nerve. So those are the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They emerge directly from the brain. They go out and supply structures primarily in the head region, some sensory kinds of things, some motor kinds of things. Matter of fact, all of the cranial nerves carry some sensory fibers, and all but 3 of them carry motor fibers. Can you take a look at the list we just produced and and what we said about them, and can you figure out which three pairs are sensory only? Which three pairs are sensory only? Eva?
Probably the optic nerve, the olfactory nerve, and the vestibulocochlear nerve.
That's good. Number 1, olfactory. Number 2, optic nerve. And number 8, vestibulocochlear. Those are sensory only. And all the rest of them carry at least some motor fibers, and of course many of them carry some sensory fibers as well. Let's catch ourselves up here. Let's review a graphic that looks at the, these cranial nerves have these same connective tissue ensheathments around them. So we'll look at this graphic and remind ourselves that around any nerve, there's going to be CT proper ensheathments. The outer the outer connective tissue around the whole nerve is going to be called epineurium. Perineurium around individual bundles of fibers within that nerve, and endoneurium, the CT proper investure around a single nerve fiber. And let's see how we did. Let's check ourselves against the graphics that we've produced for cranial nerves. We want to remind ourselves that cranial nerves do originate directly from the brain. There's 12 pairs. That means 24 total, but 12 pairs because there's left and right versions, each of the 12. They're primarily distributed to structures in the head and neck. They all carry sensory fibers, and all but 3 carry motor fibers. And we'll go to the next graphic very quickly here and take a look at the major functions that we've just mentioned. Olfactory nerve, sensory fibers related to olfaction. That's the fancy word that means sense of smell. Optic nerve, sensory fibers related to vision. Oculomotor nerve, motor fibers to several different eye muscles, and so forth and so on. Any questions about anything that you see here on this graphic? Again, Starley asked, the abducens nerve, that one eye muscle that it supplies is the lateral rectus muscle. The one eye muscle that the trochlear nerve supplies is the superior oblique muscle. And those will make more sense when we get to those regions of the head. Yes?
Now on the trigeminal nerve, it's got the ophthalmic, the maxillary nerve, and the mandibular nerve. Are those separate nerves, or are they all part of the...
What actually happens, let's go to the overhead for just a second to answer Bryce's question. When the trigeminal nerve comes off the brain, it actually splits into these 3 branches very soon after it originates. It kind of trifurcates, Bryce. And each one of these 3 actually goes through a different hole in the skull to get out of the cranial cavity. So one of these is the ophthalmic nerve, one's the maxillary nerve, and one's the mandibular nerve. That's the deal there. Starley?
While we're on this, is the ophthalmic only sensory, and then the maxillary and mandibular contain both then?
Of those 3 branches, the ophthalmic and the maxillary are sensory only, and the only branch of the trigeminal nerve that has motor fibers in it is the mandibular. What it does is and I probably failed to mention that when we were talking about those, but it actually goes out to the muscles of mastication. So it has some sensory fibers in it, but I think I failed to mention the motor output from the mandibular nerve. In addition to being sensory from the tongue and the lower teeth, it also carries motor fibers out to the chewing muscles, the muscles of mastication.
Thank you.
Sure. Let's take a look at the next graphic here. Shows us the next 3 cranial nerves, and just summarize what we said about them. Facial nerve gets a little more complex when you get into some of these later ones. See, these do a lot of different kinds of things. At least the facial and the glossopharyngeal do. And I think we mentioned those kinds of things. Sensory fibers from the internal ear only for the vestibulocochlear nerve, and a lot of different things that the glossopharyngeal nerve does. And finally, let's put up the graphic that talks about the last 3. You can see the vagus nerve. We mentioned a lot of things that it did. Accessory nerve and hypoglossal nerve are just distributed to certain skeletal muscles here in the neck and here in the tongue. Any questions about anything regarding to cranial nerves? Bryce?
On the vestibular cochlear nerve, it says that it's sensory only, but sometimes when you're around loud noises, you can kind of feel your ears close off to kind of deaden the sounds.
But the vestibulocochlear nerve is not carrying any motor impulses out to anything that involves movements at all. Those are other, maybe associated with your ear. The people that can wiggle their ears, for example, I used to have that talent. I seem to have lost it now. But it's actually the facial nerve that's supplying a muscle up here and deep to the skin of the scalp that's actually pulling on the skin that's causing these ears to wiggle.
Okay.
Humans do have some little tiny vestigial muscles, auricular muscles, but they don't really move the ears anymore. You know, dogs and horses are good about moving their ears around. You know, dogs can do it to a limited extent, but when we wiggle our ears, we're actually moving our scalp a little bit with a muscle called the epicranius muscle that does that.
What is it that kind of deadens the sound? So
There's some, and we'll talk about that when we get to the ear.
Okay.
There's actually some skeletal muscle structures within the middle ear that are involved in making a change when you're exposed to really loud noises.
Okay.
I want to talk about spinal nerves for a little bit. So cranial nerves came straight off the brain. Spinal nerves come directly off the spinal cord. There's about 31 pairs of them, and they are numbered within each region. Remember, we had a cervical region and a thoracic region, lumbar region, sacral region, and even a coccygeal region of the spinal cord. Remember, the spinal cord only came down to about L1, L2 of vertebrae, right? So it's not near as long as the vertebral column. But coming off as paired entities, left and right, off each region of the spinal cord, we have pairs of spinal nerves. There are actually 8 pairs that come off the cervical region, and then the number for the next 3 regions corresponds to the number of vertebral segments. So there's 12 pairs of thoracics, 5 pairs of lumbar spinal nerves, and 5 pairs of sacral spinal nerves, and then there are only usually 1 or 2 pair. Anyway, you add up the math, 8, 12, 5, 5, and 1 or 2, and that gives you 31 or 32 pairs. And it does vary from one individual to another. Sometimes there's only 1 coccygeal pair and sometimes 2. Each spinal nerve basically comes off the spinal cord, comes out through the intervertebral foramen, and is distributed to body structures at about the level where it comes through. Okay? So we go up and down the line, and they're distributed. Let's put a model back up that we looked at in a previous session. We can't see the whole model in the overhead camera, but we'll go to the overhead camera here, and I'm going to pull this down to where we can see. Here's brain up here at this end. Here comes the spinal cord, and these are the spinal nerves that are emerging as left and right paired entities, as you can see coming out here, and they're passing through intervertebral foramina. Those are little passageways between individual vertebrae within the vertebral column. They come out and they are distributed then to structures in about the level where they arise. Now, you notice up here, there's a whole bunch of them that kind of come out and exchange some fibers back and forth. And these particular spinal nerves are the ones that contribute to what we call the brachial plexus. This structure that you see right here, where there's a lot of fibers that appear to be exchanging, is called the brachial plexus. And the significance of this is that it's from this particular structure, the named nerves that supply the superior limb are derived. Same kind of thing happens down at this end. We have a bunch of lumbo and sacral spinal nerves that come out, and they exchange a bunch of fibers. You can see kind of a confusing spaghetti bowl network in this region. That's called the lumbosacral plexus, and from it, the named nerves that supply the inferior limb are derived. Okay, let's take a look at a graphic that summarizes some of the facts about the spinal nerves. They do originate directly from the spinal cord, 31 plus or minus pairs. They are sensory and motor to structures at or just below their emergence from the vertebral column. Each one has 2 major branches, an anterior branch, which comes around toward the front of the body and is sensory and motor to front structures, and a posterior branch that goes around toward the back side of the body and carries sensory and motor fibers from that to and from that region. So anterior branch, posterior branch, simply to deal with front stuff and deal with back stuff. In the next graphic, we can see that the spinal nerves are regionally numbered, and I mentioned this. Let's take a look at that graphic. Cervical part has 8 pairs emerging from it. So there's 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic spinal nerves, 5, 5, and 1 or 2 pairs. We mentioned this. Incidentally, there are 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, but do you remember how many cervical vertebrae there were? Susan?
7.
7. So what actually happens, the first pair of cervical spinal nerves gets out of the vertebral canal by passing between the skull and the first cervical vertebrae. So it goes between the skull and the axis. And then from that point on down, they do emerge through intervertebral foramina. Now, this thing that we call brachial plexus, we looked at it on a model, this exchange of fibers, that actually occurs between the anterior branches of the last four cervical and the first thoracic spinal nerve on each side. Okay? So I want to take a look at a graphic that summarizes that. It's the anterior branches of the last cervical spinal nerves and the first thoracic spinal nerve on each side that form the brachial plexus. So this is spinal nerves C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1, the anterior branches of those particular ones that form that brachial plexus. And again, the significance of the brachial plexus is that the named nerves that supply the superior limb are derived from it. Let's take a look at some of the names of some of those brachial plexus derivatives in this next graphic. There's actually 15 of them altogether, and these are just some of them. The radial nerve supplies muscles that are on the posterior brachium and posterior antebrachium. These are the, quote, extensor muscles of the elbow, carpal, and digital joints. The musculocutaneous nerve supplies the muscles primarily that flex the elbow joint. And the median and ulnar nerves are distributed to anterior antebrachial muscles as well as muscles down in the hand. There are 11 more that are primarily involved with some of the muscles up in the shoulder region that move some of the muscles of the shoulder and scapula. So that's what we mean by brachial plexus. Now, there's the same exact concept as we saw in that model a moment ago down in the lumbosacral region. The anterior branches of the lumbar and sacral spinal nerves form the lumbosacral plexus. Look at that graphic and make sure we have that down. Anterior branches of the lumbar and sacral spinal nerves that form the lumbosacral plexus on each side. Sometimes the last thoracic spinal nerve and the first coccygeal spinal nerve are involved as well. And the significance of this plexus is that from it, the 17 nerves that supply the inferior limb are derived. So let's take a look at those lumbosacral plexus derivatives on this next graphic. Femoral nerve supplies the anterior thigh muscle, the big quadriceps femoris, among others. The obturator nerve supplies mostly medial muscles of the thigh. The sciatic nerve, you actually saw that on a cadaver on the pre-taped video segment to this session. It's the largest nerve in diameter in the body. It's huge. And it goes down the back of the thigh. Branches of it supply the various hamstring muscles back there. And then it splits into two major branches, tibial nerve and common fibular nerve, that are distributed to the anterolateral and the posterior muscles of the crus. There are 14 more derivatives of the lumbosacral plexus as well. So those are the major branches of the lumbosacral plexus. Any questions about those? I want to go to the overhead camera for just a minute, and I want to pretend like we've got a nerve coming down a limb here. And when that nerve comes down the limb, if you follow it over in the cadaver lab, it'll be, reasonably large up here, relatively large, but it'll get smaller and smaller and smaller as you continue down the limb because branches are coming off of it and being distributed to the various structures that nerve supplies. Now, if we sever this particular nerve right here, we cut it by accident, we will disrupt the transmission of motor impulses on down to any structures that would be down here, and we will disrupt with this severance the transmission of any sensory impulses that are coming this direction within that nerve, but we will not disrupt any motor or sensory impulses located in this region. And why is that? Well, because we haven't cut those fibers. Those nerve fibers only come down to this region. So we haven't even cut, even though we've cut the nerve per se, where we cut it makes a difference how many fibers that we actually transect at that location. Down here, we're transecting relatively few fibers. Up here, we're transecting a lot more. So the higher a nerve is transected or severed, the more loss of function that will result from that physical injury, simply because a larger number of the total fibers within that nerve will have been disrupted. So please appreciate that when we talk about a nerve, appreciate there's motor fibers going down the nerve, going to muscular and glandular type effectors, and there's sensory fibers carrying impulses that are going to be interpreted as hot, cold, pressure, pain, touch, that sort of thing, that are traveling up the same nerve. The fibers are actually different fibers, but they're bound together within the same nerve. Any questions there? Amber?
So like when you have surgery and they cut, and maybe after, if you have a scar, you don't have feeling, is it because those nerves have been severed there?
Quite often, if you have a major, laceration, which surgery may be, may involve, you'll have some localized, it'll be very minimal typically, but there'll be a localized loss of sensory function in that particular area. And some of that will tend to come back with time, but you quite often will have a little dead area that you don't feel anything. Now, the loss of a little bit of general sensory perception from a small area of skin is not a major, does not have major impact on our lives. Certainly not the same kind of impact that, say, transection of an optic nerve would, where all the impulses related to vision from that one particular eye would be involved.
Thanks.
Starley?
You had said that each nerve splits into an anterior and a posterior branch. Are those included with the C5, C6, C7, C8, or do those not branch?
The plexus itself is only formed by the anterior branches. The posterior branches of C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1 aren't involved in the brachial plexus.
Or in the superior
They
limb?
peel off and supply posterior structures on the body, but they're not forming the nerves that are actually motor to structures that supply the muscles of the superior limb.
Thanks.
Sure. Another thing I want to talk about, let's go back to this overhead camera. We got this nerve that we left disrupted here. A surgeon, of course, can go in and if a major nerve trunk is traumatically disrupted, can sew this thing back together by putting the sutures out in the epimysium, or the connective tissue proper ensheathment, around the bundle. But just sewing that back together does not reestablish the connections. Basically, the parts of the neurons distal to the transection will die off, and they have to be regenerated from the proximal severed ends. And that, I think we mentioned in a previous session, is a very slow, drawn-out process. The regeneration occurs at the rate of about 1 centimeter a month. Now, 1 centimeter a month, if we have a nerve that's disrupted fairly high up a limb, it's going to take a lot of months, for that axons to regenerate, clear down to wherever that's heading. And the other problem that we have is making sure that connective tissue ingrowth or scar tissue doesn't block the regeneration to keep the axons from growing on down and regenerating the way they're supposed to. Yeah,
Even
Adam?
if it regenerates all the way down with no scar tissue ingrowth, what kind of assurance is there that it's going to get back and innervate the same, motor units that it was before?
As a matter of fact, sometimes, quite often, there is a bit of a mix-up, and some rarely, even in the best case scenario, there's usually some loss of function because not all of them regenerated, not all of them got into the right place. Sometimes some relearning can occur. Used to be when I thought about that, this is what happened, and now when I think about it, this is what happens. Are you with me?
Yes.
And that kind of thing does occur to a limited degree. Of course, it happens so slowly that you automatically adjust to it, but that is a concern. I want to show you how a spinal nerve comes off the spinal cord. And I know we looked at a model the other day, but I think it might behoove us to draw our own. So let's go to the overhead camera, and we're going to let this represent the central canal of the spinal cord, and this represent the gray matter, and this represent the white matter surrounding it. A given spinal nerve actually emerges as a bundle of anterior and posterior rootlets. This happens on both sides, but I'm just going to do it over here on this one side, so we'll let this one go over here. These posterior rootlets actually coalesce to form a single posterior root which has an enlargement on it, a swelling, called the sensory ganglion. The anterior root, formed by the coalescence of these anterior rootlets, does not have a ganglion on it. And then when these two roots come together, posterior root and anterior root, when they actually join together, this then is a spinal nerve. And here we go, Starley. You were asking about anterior and posterior branches. The spinal nerve will divide almost right away, once it forms, into a somewhat smaller posterior branch and a somewhat larger anterior branch. And of course, this is headed to structures on the back side of the body, and this one's headed for structures on the front side of the body. So that's kind of the general plan of how that works. Any questions about that? Again, posterior rootlets, posterior root, sensory ganglion, anterior rootlets, anterior root of a spinal nerve, and then when these two come together, right, this location, then we have the spinal nerve itself. And then this is a posterior branch of the spinal nerve, and this is the anterior branch. Eva?
Yeah, you mentioned also that there are motor ganglia. Where are those located?
We haven't talked about ganglia yet. I want to take just a few minutes in the time that we have remaining to spend on ganglia. So thanks for bringing that up and reminding me about that. Let's go to the overhead. And I want to make sure that we know we got two kinds of ganglia. One is sensory, and the other is motor. Another word that is used to describe these is autonomic. So if you see that someplace, it's the same as a motor ganglion. Let's remind ourselves what a ganglion is. It's a group of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Now, if the neurons in that structure are sensory neurons, then the ganglion is a sensory ganglion. And if the neurons that are in that structure are motor neurons, then that ganglion is a motor ganglion. Now, sensory ganglia, we just looked when we drew that last drawing we made when we made this little bleb or swelling on that posterior root of that spinal nerve. We said that's a sensory ganglion right there. What we find in there are sensory neurons, mostly pseudo-unipolar. Remember the little ones with the offset cell bodies? Pseudo-unipolar neurons. There's no synapsing in there because it's just where the neuron cell bodies are located. Okay? Let me draw that just a little bit larger. It doesn't show up too well on camera here. Just make the ganglion bigger. Pseudo-unipolar neurons, because most sensory neurons are pseudo-unipolar. And of course, it's transmitting an impulse this direction. This would be dendrite, that'd be axon. This is going to go on into the spinal cord. No synapses in sensory ganglion. The neurons in there are sensory neurons. Motor ganglia, on the other hand, the neurons that are found in there are motor neurons. And we'll just say this is the motor ganglion. There's actually specific names for the neurons involved here, the ones whose cell bodies make up the ganglion. We'll just let that guy right there be the multipolar neuron whose cell body's making up the ganglion. Those are called postganglionic neurons, P-O-S-T ganglionic neurons. And this one right here, this axon coming in to synapse there, is the preganglionic neuron. Now, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us right now, but this is the ganglion where a bunch of these cell bodies would be located. It's a motor ganglion because these neurons are motor ganglia, and we're going to make a whole lot more sense out of what we mean by preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons when we talk about the autonomic nervous system in a future session. All right, we've talked about cranial nerves. We've talked about spinal nerves, and we've talked about ganglia. Anybody have any questions on those subjects? Eva?
I was just wondering, this is more of a pathological thing, but when someone loses a limb or a body part, what causes that like phantom pain that people feel even though the limb's gone? If the nerves have been severed, how do they feel sensations from something that's gone?
Yeah, phantom pain is when you don't have that part anymore, but it still hurts. Like I've had an amputation of this limb, maybe, in this location, but it still feels like I got an itch down here on this hand. Those are kind of disturbing because there's not a place to scratch, you know what I mean? Called phantom pain. What's actually happening there, Eva, is that, yeah, we severed all the nerves when we did the amputation of the limb. There are some short circuits that are occurring, but involving some of the stumps. Remember, when we sever a nerve, the proximal part, the neuron is still alive. The distal part dies away, but the proximal part is still alive. So as it makes abortive attempts at regeneration, sometimes you get short circuits and there'll be an impulse transmitted by it, even though there shouldn't be an impulse transmitted by it. It's kind of like when the insulation wears off the extension cord and you grab the bare copper wires, you know about it, okay? And so what's happening there is, that used to supply something down here in my hand. If it feels like my hand itches, used to go all the way down there, doesn't anymore, but it's generating an impulse as though a sensory receptor had synapsed with it. Now, something that's related to phantom pain, but somewhat, is called referred pain, and you may have heard of that. Referred pain is when you actually have something going on in a certain part of the body, but it feels like it's going on someplace else, and you have all those parts. I don't know if you've ever had this experience or not. Anybody here ever slam their fingers in a door? Like you leave them right where the car door is supposed to close. And not only does it hurt out there at your fingertips, but sometimes you get a pain in your chest. Anybody here ever had that happen? Mm-hmm. Okay. And so here's where the pain is occurring, and yes, it hurts there, but you also get a pain in here. There's some short circuits when the sensory impulses get into the spinal cord. There's some short circuits that occur with some other sensory neurons coming from another location, and you can get pain that's referred to another area, even though it's occurring, the physical damage is occurring someplace else.
So does that happen like in a heart attack?
Yes, it can happen in a heart attack. There's some of that kind of thing happens when you get the thing streaming down your limb. All right, that takes care of today's session. We'll meet again and talk about autonomic nervous system.